In today's video, you will add the feature that increase the clicking power. You can click the cookie, and if you have enough count, you can buy an upgrade. And now your clicking power is 2. So each time when I click cookie, it adds the count of 2. So this is the project from our previous part. Here we have only count and a cookie. And we also can click the cookie to increase the count. And we need to add buttons for increase click power and increase auto click power. It seems that we need to add only 2 buttons, but actually each text that you see is a separate HTML element. Let's start from the adding buttons. So currently in my HTML file, we have only p tag for the count and the image tag. Now I will add a button tag. Now you see that we have 2 buttons and they already have some default styles. The first problem that we have that we want to change the alignment of these buttons. If you look at our CSS file, you will see that currently our body has the display of flags with the flags direction of column. This is important to understand that our body is all the page that we see, and all elements that are inside the body will have the alignment of column. But we want to add both buttons on the same level. So how to do it? These are the elements that we have in our HTML, and we need to group them in order to change the alignment. All this page is our body, and the body should see only 3 elements. So we have to group last 2 elements in order to change their alignment. So if we inspect this page by right click, then inspect, this is the HTML code for this project. So inside of the body, we have only 3 elements: our p tag for count, our cookie image, and the section for our buttons. So when the body tag adjusts the position of elements, it adjusts only the position of these 3 elements. And then inside of the section, we can put our buttons and change the position of these buttons. To make a group of elements, I have to add a section tag. Now inside of the body, we have only 3 elements. We have our p tag, then our image, and then our section. And now when I save this file, you see that the position of our elements have been changed. Currently, the default position for buttons suits very well, but let's clearly define the right position. So in the CSS file, right after all this code, we will write the CSS in a slightly different way. All this code that we have in the CSS applied directly to HTML tags, body tag, p tag, or image tag. But if we have a lot of elements on our page, it is very difficult to manage styles. And for that, you use classes. Generally, we apply most of our styles to classes. For that, in the HTML, I add a new attribute class. In this section, I will write class, then press enter. And now I can give the name for this section. For example, I can call it shop. Then I save this file, and now I can change our styles. To access a specific style, we need to put a dot and then to write the name of the class. So in our case, this is shop. And now I can apply style properties. We want to apply display flags with the flags direction of raw. So now we explicitly defined the alignment for these elements, and if we add more elements, it will not break the alignment. Now let's add all the remaining elements. We should add all these p tags with the specific text. So in our HTML, we should add the text for our current click power. And let's also add the text for our auto click power. Now we see that our font is too big, and this is because we applied the font size of 100 pixels directly to all p tags. I don't want to change our previously written CSS, but let's change the font size of these 2 elements. this selector applies only to p tags that are inside of the shop class. If you hover over this selector, you will see that no matter which HTML element that has the class of shop and that has p tags inside will have these styles. And you see that the font size of our text have been changed. Let's also change the font weight. And now again we have the same problem that we want to align these elements in the column. So they should be above our button. All these elements have the alignment of column. Currently we have 3 groups of elements. Now in the last group we have elements that should be aligned in the row. And then these 2 elements should be aligned in the column. The same with these 2 elements. It means that we need to create 2 additional groups. And now you see that they have the right alignment, but again, we can define the explicit alignment of these elements. For that, I need to give a class for each section. So I will give the same class for them. And both these classes will share the same styles. So I added the display of flags with the flags direction of column, and now you see that we have the right alignment. For the last text elements, we don't need to create a new section, we can add them inside of the button element. In this case, we will need to write less CSS code, but it is also possible to group them with the section element, but I think that this is a slightly more complex way. Inside of our button, I delete the text, I expand this tag, and now I will add p tags with the same text as we have on this page. So now we have the text inside of our first button. Let's do the same with the second button. Now we have all the HTML elements that we need. Now let's style these elements in the same way. If you inspect this page, you will see that all these p tags has the default margin of 60 pixels. So let's remove it. I want to remove this margin only for p tags that are inside of our shop class. Now I put margin 0, but I want to add the additional space inside of these buttons. So let's choose the button tag. Again, we choose only buttons which are inside the shop class. And now I can add additional padding. Also, I want to increase the size of this button. And now I want to align our text to the left side. For that, we have a shorthand text align. So we don't need to provide the display flags property. And I also think that these buttons are too close to each other. So I want to add additional margin. But if I use the common margin property, I don't like the position of our button's title. So we want to create only this space between 2 buttons. And for that, I can use margin left. Or it is better to use margin right. So now I like the position of our buttons, but let's change the background color of these buttons. Now our buttons are too dark, so I will change the color of our font. And also I want to change the border. You can use another color. So for example, instead of this border color, you can write blue color, and then you will see the square. And if you change this color, you can see RGB color, or you can click on this header and then it will be changed to a hexadecimal code. So you can use whatever colors you like. I just like to use very specific colors, and this is the reason why I use hexadecimal code. I return back the color for our border, and I also can round our borders. And for that, I have the property of border radius. In our final version, you also can see that I have the animation when I hover over the button. Let's add the same animation. For that, I need to use a complex selector, which is very similar to this selector that we used for our cookie. This is called pseudo selector. And now instead of the active selector, I use hover selector. It triggers the body when we hover over our buttons. And now you see that the color of our border becomes a bit lighter. Also, I want to slightly increase the size of the button. For that, I can use the scale property of 1.01. So it means that we increase the scale of our button in 1%. And now if I hover over our button, you see a nice little animation. In our image, we used an active selector, which triggers the body if we click on the element. But for the animation for our buttons, we use the hover selector, and it triggers the body if we hover over the button. When I click this button, we don't have any animation, but you can add additional animation when you click on the button, and for that you need to write a new complex selector with the active selector. So something like that. You can change the color to red, and when you hover over, you see that your border becomes a bit lighter, but if you click this button, you see that the border changes to the red. But I don't like the styles for this project. I delete the active state. We also see that the color of the text in the button is different. So for that, let's add new classes for each p tag. So in our HTML, for our cost, let's add a new class cost. And for our description, I add a new class description. And the same classes I will add for our auto-click button. And now in the CSS, let's change the colors of these buttons. And for our cost, I can use the built-in gold color. And for our description, I can use the same color as for the borders. Actually, I think that our text is too close to each other, so I want to increase margin a bit. Here, when we changed the margin of our p tags, I will add a small margin of 4 pixels. And now if I compare it with the result, I see that this shop section has additional space between the cookie image. Let's add this additional space. Inside of the shop tag, I will add margin top of 52 pixels. And now you see that our styles are absolutely the same as in the result. So now we can click our cookie and we can click our button, but it doesn't do anything. So let's define the behavior of our buttons in the JavaScript file. Let's go to our JavaScript file, and here we have the code that increases the count when we click our image. So let's separate them with the comments. Now we can write the code for our click power button. The structure will be the same. As you remember, we should initialize variables in the JavaScript, and then we need to change the HTML based on these variables. So for our cookie, we initialized the count, then we accessed two elements, count and the cookie, from the HTML file. Then we wrote a function that increases the count, and then we wrote the trigger when this function must be executed. These are 4 basic steps that we need to do. So let's start from the variables. Which numbers we want to change on this page? The current click power shows the current power of our click, and we want to change this number. The same with auto click power. Also, we want to increase the cost every time when user upgrade his power to increase the difficulty. So let's add these variables into JavaScript. For these variables, I use the keyword let because I need to change these variables later. Now let's access the elements that we want to change in the HTML. For that, I will use the same document getElementById function. But to access elements by ID, we need to add these IDs in our HTML file. I want to access current click power tag, current auto click power tag, costs, and also buttons. So in the HTML file, let's add ID to all these elements. So this is our current click power, and I add the attribute ID, which is generally the first attribute after our text name. And also you may have a question why I separate words with uppercase. For IDs, I use camel case if I want to use these IDs in JavaScript. So this is the convention. For classes, I used keep uppercase that separate words with a hyphen because this is the convention for CSS. But if I want to use the same IDs in the CSS, in this case, it is better to use keep uppercase for the consistency. In this project, I use IDs only in the JavaScript file, so I use the camel case. I also added the ID for our click cost, and here is one important moment that all IDs should be unique. So if you add an ID, be sure that this ID is unique. So this is the reason why I can't use the name cost for our ID, because in this case I can't recognize the click power button cost and auto click power button cost. And also I want to add IDs for our buttons. Totally I added 6 different IDs. And now we can access these elements in our JavaScript. I added first 3 elements from our click power button. Be sure that the IDs that you write in the getElementById function matches the IDs that you set in your HTML file. Now I added all these elements to our JavaScript file, and I found that in index.html I wrote autoclick buttons ID, but I want to change it to autoclick button. So be careful when you name your IDs. In the next step, I want to write a function that will define the behavior for our buttons. First of all, let's think of what we want to add to this function. So first of all, because our button has a specific cost, we need to validate if the user has enough cookies. The second step is to update all the variables that we have in JavaScript. And then we need to update the corresponding HTML elements. So now you see the steps. Try to write this function yourself. But now let's write it together. For the validation, we can use if statement. And we need to check that if the count is more or equal to the click cost. If the user has enough cookies, we can update our GS variables. So we need to update the count, the price, and the current click power. A new count is equal to count minus click cost. And for that, we have a shorthand count minus equal click cost. So we just subtract the cost from the total count. Then we can increase the click power by 1. And then I update our click cost, and for that I use the multiplier of 1.4. The initial click cost is 10, and then we multiply 10 by 1.4, so the next click cost is 14. If you want to increase the difficulty, you can change this multiplier, for example, to 1.6. Or if you want to decrease the difficulty, you can decrease this multiplier. I want to use 1.4. You also can create a new variable multiplier where you will store this value, especially if you want to use it for the auto click cost power. But I want to use 2 different multipliers, and just for the simplicity, I would hard code this value to 1.4. Now let's update the HTML elements. For the count, I have the count element from the beginning. And then we change the text content of these elements. And here we have the static part of count plus our variable. And eventually this line will be count 1, count 2, and so on. Then I want to change the click power title. The static part will be current click power, and the dynamical part will be the click power variables that we have in our JavaScript. And in the same way, we change the cost element. So now our function is finished, and the last step is to write the trigger when this function must be executed. So we want to execute this function when we click our button. So our button needs the trigger, and for that we will use addEventListener function, where we define the trigger when it is executed. So in our case, this is clicked, and then we pass the function's name without the parenthesis. So if you add parenthesis to the function's name, it is executed immediately. So I use click button element. Here I add event listener. Our target is click, and the function that we must execute is increase click power. So now we can test our game. So the initial power is 1, so when I click the cookie it increased by 1. Now my count is 10 and I want to buy the upgrade. So now I have the click power of 2, the count of 0 and the cost of 14. But if I click the cookie, the count still grows by 1. The mistake that we have in our project is related to our previous code. So in our cookie and count part, if we look at the increase count function, we can see that we actually increase the count by 1. But we want to increase our count by the click power. So let's change this line to count plus equal click power. Now I test this game again. I have the count of 10. I can upgrade our click power. And now when I click my cookie, the count grows by 2. Now my count is 14. I can buy a new cost. Now you see that our cost has a lot of decimal numbers. Let's round the cost to the integer. For that, in our increase click power function, we can add the math.round function. So this function rounds our number to the integer using the mathematical rules. And now if I test our game again, it works correctly. In the next video, we will implement our auto click button and finish with this game project.